The city that lived too boldly. The city that lived too boldly. The city that lived too boldly. Wilmington, North Carolina, at the end of the 19th century, was a city that existed against expectation. It was not large enough to command national attention, nor remote enough to be dismissed as frontier experiment. It sat along the slow, deliberate bend of the Cape Fear River, where the air carried the scent of brine and timber, tar and tobacco. Ships moved in and out with the patience of commerce. Cotton bales stacked high along docks like silent witnesses to a regional economy still recalibrating after catastrophe. The Civil War had ended more than 3 decades earlier. Reconstruction, that fragile attempt to rebuild both union and morality, had formally concluded. Federal troops were gone. Across the South, white Democratic legislatures had reasserted control with efficiency sharpened by resentment. And yet Wilmington resisted the pattern. Here, something improbable persisted. More than half the city's population was black. Many were formerly enslaved. Many were skilled artisans and tradesmen whose labor had built not only houses but dignity. Brick masons shaped the skyline. Carpenters framed neighborhoods. Longshoremen moved goods with practiced rhythm. Barbers and tailors conducted quiet commerce in storefronts where conversation was currency. Teachers instructed children in modest classrooms lit by ambition rather than electricity. They were not merely surviving. They were governing. Black aldermen occupied seats on the city council. Black magistrates interpreted local law. Black policemen patrolled streets in blue wool jackets with brass buttons polished bright against morning light. The mayor was white. The coalition government was biracial. It functioned imperfectly, sometimes awkwardly, but it functioned. That functionality was the threat. In 1898, progress in the South was not simply controversial. It was combustible. Wilmington stood as a living contradiction to the ideology consolidating across the former Confederacy. It demonstrated that interracial political cooperation was not theoretical, it was operational. And in doing so, it destabilized the narrative that white supremacy required governance to function. The city's success made it visible. Visibility made it dangerous. The ink-stained catalyst. At 214 7th Street stood the modest office of the Daily Record, the only black-owned newspaper in North Carolina. The building was unremarkable to passers-by. Narrow windows, wooden floors that creaked underfoot, 2 presses heavy with oil and iron. Inside worked Alexander Manley. He was 32 years old, educated, composed, and possessed of an intelligence that unsettled his critics precisely because it was disciplined. Ink often stained his fingers. His posture suggested deliberation rather than urgency. He spoke softly. He wrote with precision. His ancestry itself challenged Southern racial mythology. He was the grandson of a white governor and an enslaved black woman. His existence was proof of contradictions the white elite preferred remain unexamined. Manley did not indulge in euphemism. In August 1898, Rebecca Felton of Georgia publicly declared that lynching was justified to protect white womanhood from black male predation. Her speech spread through Southern newspapers like a controlled burn. Manley read it twice. Then he responded. He wrote plainly that many alleged assaults were consensual relationships. He wrote that white men had exploited black women for generations without punishment. He wrote that morality applied in both directions. It was not rhetorical excess. It was factual correction, but truth delivered without deference in 1898 was perceived as provocation. He printed the editorial. He did not anticipate how quickly it would become ammunition. The campaign of fear. The response was not spontaneous outrage. It was organized escalation. White Democratic leaders across North Carolina launched what they openly titled the White Supremacy Campaign. The phrasing was not subtle. It did not need to be. Posters depicted grotesque caricatures of black officials. Pamphlets warned of racial domination. Speeches invoked civilization under siege. Newspapers repeated phrases like Negro rule and protection of white womanhood until repetition hardened into belief. The red shirts, paramilitary riders clad in crimson garments, traveled on horseback through rural counties. Rifles rested visibly across their backs. They did not whisper intimidation. They performed it. The message traveled faster than fact. If black political power continued, white civilization would collapse. Elections were scheduled for November 8, 1898. The date became less an administrative event than an existential referendum. The private rooms. Public rallies stirred emotion. Private rooms refined strategy. 9 prominent white men, business leaders, lawyers, editors, former Confederate officers, met quietly. They were pragmatic. They understood that violence must appear corrective rather than aggressive. They drafted what would later be called the White Declaration of Independence. It demanded removal of black officials, dismantling of the biracial government, suppression of the Daily Record, restoration of white political control. The language echoed revolutionary documents intentionally. The irony was structural. They framed overthrow as liberation. They prepared enforcement. November 10, 1898. The morning began cold. Before sunrise, hundreds of armed white men gathered at the Wilmington Light Infantry Armory. They did not resemble chaos. They resembled organization. Tailored coats, suspended dockworkers, former officers with medals pinned deliberately to lapels. Some carried Winchester rifles, others pistols, many both. They moved in formation. Their first destination, 7th Street. Alexander Manly had already fled. Friends had warned him. He packed lightly, clothes, a notebook, a pistol he hoped never to use. When the armed men reached the Daily Record, they found it empty. They shattered windows first. Glass fell like brief applause. They overturned desks, dragged typecases into the street, scattered metal letters across dirt. Ink and paper met flame. Fire climbed quickly, consuming not only timber and press machinery, but the only black newspaper voice in the state. Cheers rose. Then the violence expanded. Gunfire cracked across black neighborhoods. Some residents attempted defensive resistance. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Bodies fell in streets. Some were carried away quietly. Others were taken toward the river. Official records minimized the dead. Eyewitnesses did not. By noon, armed leaders marched to City Hall. Elected officials were summoned. Resignations were demanded. Rifles were visible. Signatures followed. Alfred Waddell was installed as mayor without ballot or debate. It was not a riot. It was a coup, the only successful overthrow of an elected municipal government in American history. The morning after. The next morning, newspapers described a race riot. The word mattered. Riot implies chaos, mutual aggression, shared culpability. Coup implies planning, direction, intent. Language reshaped memory before memory could solidify. Black leaders were exiled. Businesses collapsed. Literacy tests and poll taxes followed within 2 years, effectively disenfranchising black voters statewide. Wilmington's brief experiment in integrated governance vanished. What remained was correction masquerading as restoration. The long silence. For decades, survivors spoke cautiously, if at all. Fear passed generationally, inherited like heirloom china wrapped in warning. Don't talk about that. Records disappeared. Photographs were lost. Textbooks softened language. The truth did not vanish. It was curated. It was not until 2006 that an official state commission formally acknowledged the event as a coup and massacre. By then, every direct witness had died. The pattern beyond the city. Wilmington was not anomaly. It was prototype. Manufactured crisis. Moral panic. Delegitimization. Parallel authority. Legal codification. Violence established leverage. Law secured it. The sequence echoed across southern states, shaping the architecture of Jim Crow for generations. The river. The Cape Fear River still flows past Wilmington. Tourists stroll the riverwalk. Boats glide across reflective water. There is now a memorial. Water does not remember names. But cities can, and whether they do determines what repeats. The city that should not have fallen. The family that stayed. Not everyone fled. Some could not afford train fare north. Some believed staying was defiance. Some were simply too rooted to be uprooted. In a narrow wooden house on Campbell Street, Elijah Moore barred his front door on the morning of November 10, 1898. as smoke rose in a dark column toward a pale sky. He had built that house with his own hands. Pine beams, hand-planed. Brick chimney, set straight. Floorboards aligned carefully enough that they did not creak unless stepped on carelessly. He had voted in Wilmington's elections. He had believed the act meant permanence. That belief burned faster than the newspaper office. Gunfire echoed irregularly across the neighborhood. Not sustained battle, just sharp interruptions in the morning's stillness. His wife Clara gathered their children into the back room and whispered prayers so softly the words blurred together. Elijah held a shotgun across his lap. The men who came to his block were searching for someone else. They had lists, names that mattered politically, names that could organize resistance. Elijah's invisibility saved him, but invisibility reshapes a man. After that day, Elijah never voted again. Not because he legally could not. Because he had witnessed how easily paper rights turned to ash. He built houses instead. Wood lasts longer than promises, he told his son. The children who learned silence. The architects who prospered. While black families dispersed, the architects of the coup consolidated. Alfred Waddell governed as mayor. Josephus Daniels expanded his media empire. Hugh McCrae developed neighborhoods that would define Wilmington's growth for decades. They attended galas. They gave speeches. They were remembered publicly as restorers of order. Streets bore their names. Schools honored them. Their grandchildren inherited not only wealth, but narrative. History is stabilized by those who write it. And for decades, they wrote it. The law as cement. The violence of November 10th was not the coup's greatest victory. Its greatest victory came quietly. In 1900, North Carolina voters approved constitutional amendments instituting literacy tests and poll taxes. Grandfather clauses exempted poor whites from restrictions while excluding black voters. The sequence was surgical. Violence created urgency. Law created permanence. By 1904, black voter registration had nearly vanished across the state. Wilmington had demonstrated a method. Other states refined it. Colfax, Hamburg, Ocoee, each followed a similar arc: advancement, backlash, violence, legal entrenchment. Democracy erodes locally before it collapses nationally. The economic fracture. Before 1898, Wilmington's black middle class was expanding. Afterward, capital constricted. Credit became conditional. Insurance claims were denied. Property was sold under duress. Land transfers increasingly favored white consolidation. Economic trauma compounds across generations. If one generation loses land, the next loses collateral. Without collateral, there is no leverage. Without leverage, there is dependency. By mid-century, racial wealth disparities in Wilmington were measurable, not as sudden accidents, but as cumulative consequence. History does not merely happen. It accrues interest. The world wars and shifting ground. Thomas Moore's son, Elijah Jr., fought in World War II under a segregated unit. He wore an American uniform abroad while his grandparents' voting rights remained suppressed at home. He witnessed fascism defeated in Europe. He returned to Jim Crow in North Carolina. The contradiction was not abstract. It was lived. After the war, he used the GI Bill to attend trade school. Opportunities expanded incrementally, but political power remained constrained. It would take until 1965, nearly 70 years after the coup, for federal voting protections to restore what Wilmington once practiced freely. The Voting Rights Act did not create new rights. It reinforced old ones. Excavating the archive. In the 1990s, historians began revisiting Wilmington's archival record with new questions. Private letters surfaced, meeting minutes, editorial drafts, personal diaries. A pattern emerged unmistakably. The event had never been forgotten. It had been reframed. Textbooks softened language. Race disturbance, political instability, riot. The word coup was absent. In 2006, the North Carolina 1898 Wilmington Race Riot Commission formally acknowledged what survivors had always known. The violence was premeditated. The government was overthrown. Black citizens were targeted deliberately. More than a century had passed. Recognition does not resurrect the dead, but it interrupts denial.
The Descendant and the Ledger. In 2018, Caroline Waddell found a cedar box in her attic. Inside, a ledger belonging to her great-great-grandfather, one of the men involved in 1898. The entries were logistical: payments, transportation, coordination, no rage, no justification, only execution. Infrastructure is harder to deny than rhetoric. When the ledger became public, Wilmington divided once more, not by gunfire, but by memory. Caroline spoke publicly. I cannot change what my ancestor did, but I can refuse to hide it. Reckoning is rarely dramatic. It is incremental, like erosion, like rebuilding. The structural echo. Scholars now study Wilmington as a case study in democratic collapse. The sequence appears with unsettling clarity. Manufactured crisis, moral panic, delegitimization of opponents, parallel power structures, legal codification. It did not require suspension of the Constitution. It required narrative control. The coup did not begin with gunfire. It began with headlines. What endured? Today, Wilmington is vibrant again. The port remains active. The Riverwalk attracts tourists. Children play where gunfire once echoed. There is now a memorial. School curricula include 1898. Black officials serve in office once more. Restoration is not reversal. It is recalibration. The Cape Fear River moves steadily past the city's edge, carrying sunlight and stormwater alike. It does not remember names. But the city can, and memory, when honest, is democratic infrastructure. The generational truth. The coup of 1898 did not end on November 10th. It lived in Elijah's refusal to vote, Thomas's relocation north, Elijah Jr.'s segregated service, Caroline's attic discovery, modern debates over voter access, revised textbooks, public markers. History is not static, it is cumulative. Democracy is not destroyed in one dramatic rupture. It erodes in increments, and it is rebuilt the same way, increment by increment. The city that should not have fallen. The architecture of silence. Silence is not emptiness. It has beams and joists. It has maintenance schedules. It requires caretakers. In Wilmington, silence was constructed deliberately. Public monuments honored men who had orchestrated the overthrow. Their statues did not mention gunfire or forced resignations. They referenced leadership, stability, civic restoration. Schoolchildren in the 1920s and 30s learned about race disturbances. They memorized dates without context. They were taught that political instability had required firm correction. The phrasing was antiseptic. It bled nothing. Local newspapers carried forward inherited vocabulary. Riot endured because it diffused responsibility. Riot suggested chaos. Chaos suggested inevitability. Coup suggested intent. Intent suggested crime. Silence is most durable when it feels normal. By mid-century, entire generations in Wilmington believed segregation had simply evolved organically. Few knew that multiracial governance had once operated in their own streets. When truth is removed from public memory, absence feels natural. The National Mirror. The year 1898 was not quiet nationally. The United States defeated Spain. It annexed territories overseas. It expanded its global footprint. The rhetoric was liberty. The practice was selective. While American troops raised flags in Cuba and the Philippines, armed men in Wilmington dismantled democracy under that same flag. Empires often proclaim universal ideals while restricting them domestically. Wilmington exposed that contradiction. The federal government did not intervene. President William McKinley was aware of unrest. But Reconstruction had ended decades earlier. Northern political will to enforce Southern civil rights had thinned. The Spanish-American War commanded attention. Expansion abroad overshadowed suppression at home. Guardrails weaken gradually. When they do, local actors test limits. In Wilmington, they discovered there were none. The psychological mechanism. Democracies do not fracture solely through policy. They fracture through perception. The coup's architects understood the psychology of fear. They tied demographic change to personal insecurity. They linked interracial governance to existential collapse. Fear compresses complexity into survival instinct. When survival is invoked, extraordinary measures appear rational. The men who marched in Wilmington did not describe themselves as villains. They believed they were defending civilization. That belief was the accelerant. History's most destabilizing lesson is not that monsters exist. It is that ordinary people can justify extraordinary harm when fear is framed convincingly. The 5-stage pattern. Political scientists studying democratic erosion across continents identify recurring stages. Manufactured crisis, moral panic, delegitimization of opponents, parallel power structures, legal codification of seized power. Wilmington followed this script with unsettling precision. The crisis was exaggerated. The panic was amplified. Black officials were portrayed as illegitimate. Shadow committees formed. Once power shifted, law secured it. Violence was visible. Infrastructure was quieter. Infrastructure is what endures. The Ledger revisited. When Caroline Waddell's attic discovery became public, scholars examined it not as family artifact but as structural evidence. The entries revealed payments to patrol volunteers. Transportation arranged for forced departures. Coordination between press and committee members. It was not chaos. It was administration. One historian remarked quietly, "Democratic collapse leaves receipts." The Ledger altered conversation. It removed plausible deniability. It shifted debate from whether the coup occurred to how it was organized. Public forums followed. Some residents expressed anger, others defensiveness, some relief. Reckoning is never unanimous, but once documentation surfaces, silence becomes heavier to maintain. The economic echo. Economic data from the 20th century reveals measurable divergence. Black homeownership rates lagged, business ownership stagnated, access to credit remained unequal. These disparities did not originate in abstraction. They trace through events like 1898. If property is confiscated or sold under duress, wealth trajectory alters. If political access is removed, policy influence evaporates. If education funding is uneven, opportunity contracts. History compounds. Economic aftershocks outlive headlines. By the time Wilmington's 2006 commission issued its report, generational wealth gaps were already deeply embedded. Repair cannot restore erased capital, but acknowledgement clarifies origin. Education is infrastructure. In the 21st century, North Carolina incorporated the 1898 coup into state curriculum standards. That shift was structural. When a story is taught formally, it becomes shared knowledge. It becomes harder to distort. It becomes part of civic literacy. The Cape Fear Museum redesigned its permanent exhibit. For the first time, the label read plainly, "Coup d'etat." A single word altered interpretive framing. Language is infrastructure. Accurate vocabulary stabilizes democratic memory. The modern echo. In recent decades, debates over voting access resurfaced nationally. Strict identification requirements, polling place closures, gerrymandered districts, disinformation campaigns. The contexts differ. The technologies differ. The structure feels familiar. Wilmington did not begin with gunfire. It began with narrative. Democracy rarely collapses dramatically at first. It bends procedurally. It is defended or eroded in school boards, in editorials, in city council chambers, in voter registration lines. Local decisions precede national consequences. The myth of permanence. Americans often describe democracy as enduring, but endurance is not permanence. The United States has fought a civil war, amended its constitution repeatedly, expanded and restricted suffrage in cycles, overturned elected governments at local levels. Stability has always required reconstruction, not assumption. Wilmington dismantles the comforting myth that democratic collapse is foreign to American soil. It happened here, under municipal authority, without foreign invasion. Precedent lowers psychological barriers. The phrase, "it can't happen here," evaporates under historical scrutiny. Restoration. In recent years, Wilmington has elected black officials again. Community reconciliation forums have taken place. Historical markers have been revised. Public conversations have widened. These actions do not erase 1898. They interrupt its afterlife. Restoration is not resurrection. It is recalibration. It is acknowledging fracture and reinforcing structure. The Cape Fear River continues its steady passage past docks and riverwalks. Water reflects sunlight indifferently. It carries storm surge in hurricane season. It remembers nothing consciously. Communities must remember intentionally. The core lesson. Reduce Wilmington to a single pattern and it reveals this. When fear becomes more persuasive than fact, democracy fractures. When institutions yield to pressure rather than principle, fractures widen. When violence becomes normalized, physically or rhetorically, collapse accelerates. The sequence is predictable, which means interruption is possible. Democracy is not monument, it is behavior. It survives through institutional integrity, informed citizens, independent media, economic inclusion, accountability for organized harm, honest education. Remove enough of these, and precedent becomes permission. The final question, the most important question is not, could this happen again? It already has. The more important question is, would we recognize the tipping point soon enough to stop it? Wilmington's citizens did not recognize it until rifles were visible and signatures were coerced. Modern citizens possess hindsight. Hindsight is useless, unless it informs foresight. Epilogue. The winter that refused to disappear. For decades, the winter of 1898 was minimized. Now it is documented, discussed, taught. Democratic resilience begins not in myth but in confrontation. The astonishing truth about democracy is this: it is not destroyed in one explosion. It erodes in increments, and it is rebuilt the same way, increment by increment. Wilmington was not only a city that fell, it is a city that remembers. And memory, kept honestly, is the first safeguard against repetition. The morning the city changed, Wilmington woke before the sun did. The sky over the Cape Fear River was not yet blue but a strained gray, the kind that presses low against rooftops as if reluctant to rise. The air carried November's thin cold, not sharp enough to bite, but enough to settle into lungs and make breath visible. Along Front Street, the gas lamps still burned. Their light trembled in small halos against the fog. Ships docked along the river creaked in their moorings. Ropes strained softly. Somewhere a gull cried, abrupt and solitary. The city seemed suspended. Then boots began to strike cobblestone. The armory. The Wilmington Light Infantry Armory stood solid and square against the thinning dark brick shoulders, squared like a veteran who had outlived too much. Its heavy doors were already open. Men gathered in clusters at first, quiet, measured, businesslike. No shouting, no drunken bravado. This was not the atmosphere of riot. It was the tone of appointment. Rifles rested against brick walls. Winchester lever actions gleamed faintly. Pistols were checked, reholstered. Cartridge belts adjusted. Gloves tugged tight. Some of the men wore tailored coats over vests. Others came in work shirts and suspenders. Dockworkers stood beside lawyers. Shopkeepers beside former Confederate officers. Their differences dissolved in purpose. Alfred Waddell arrived last. He did not hurry. He stepped down from his carriage with deliberate composure, gloved hands clasped behind his back as if surveying a parade rather than assembling one. His mustache was groomed precisely. His hat sat straight. The murmurs softened when he entered. Someone shut the armory doors. The sound echoed. Inside, lantern light flickered against polished rifle barrels and watch chains. The room smelled faintly of oil, leather, and wool damp from the river air. Waddell stepped onto a small wooden platform. He did not raise his voice. "Gentlemen," he began, and the word carried evenly across the room. "We are here to correct a condition that has become intolerable." No one interrupted. He spoke of civilization, of order, of white womanhood, of government captured by incompetence and corruption. He did not name violence. He named duty. "We shall act with firmness," he said, "but with discipline. Discipline." The word steadied the air. This was not chaos. This was structure. He concluded with a phrase that would be repeated for decades afterward: "We will restore this city." Restore. The men nodded. Some tightened their grips unconsciously on rifle stocks. A drummer tapped twice. The doors opened. Cold air rushed in. They stepped out. 7th Street. At 214 7th Street, the office of the Daily Record stood quiet. Its windows were dark. The narrow facade gave no indication that inside lay the only black-owned daily newspaper in North Carolina, a press that had dared print words too plainly. Alexander Manley was already gone. He had boarded a train under a name not his own in the darkness hours earlier, glancing back only once toward the city's low silhouette. He had packed quickly, a change of clothes, a notebook, a small pistol he hoped never to touch. He left bound editions of the paper behind, left ink-stained desks, left the press he had come to know by the rhythm of its clatter. He did not know that as the train wheels struck iron and sparks leapt in the night, men were gathering with rifles. He would learn later. The column turned onto 7th Street just as the first pale light crept across rooftops. Neighbors had already begun peering from behind curtains. Boots halted in formation before the modest building. Waddell surveyed it briefly. "It must not stand," he said. No one hesitated. A rifle butt struck glass. The sound was shockingly loud in the morning quiet. It shattered the fragile illusion that the day might unfold normally. Another butt followed. Windows exploded outward, shards scattering across the wooden porch and dirt street. Men surged forward. The door splintered inward beneath repeated blows. Inside, the air was stale with ink and paper. Typecases were overturned first. Metal letters spilled across the floor in metallic cascades. Desks were shoved aside. One man seized a stack of freshly printed papers and tore them in half before scattering them like fallen leaves. The press, iron, heavy, deliberate, was attacked with almost personal fury. Levers bent, gears smashed, ink rollers ripped free. A young man in the crowd, barely 20, paused mid-swing. He had read the paper once. He remembered the editorial, not because he agreed with it, but because it had unsettled him. It had named things no one named aloud. He hesitated. Someone shoved past him. "Don't stop now," another man barked. Oil-soaked rags were produced. Matches struck. The first flame flickered uncertainly, then caught. Paper ignites greedily. Fire climbed quickly along walls lined with dry timber. Heat swelled. Smoke thickened. Men retreated onto the street as flames burst through broken windows. Cheers rose. The young man who had hesitated felt his throat tighten. He had imagined this moment would feel triumphant. Instead, it felt irreversible. 3. Campbell Street. Across town, Elijah Moore stood on his front porch. He had not slept much. Rumors had moved through the black neighborhoods the night before like cold drafts under doorframes. Something was coming. Something organized. He had watched, from a distance, the column assembling at the armory. He counted rifles without meaning to. Now he saw smoke. It rose in a thick column from the direction of 7th Street, darker than chimney smoke, denser than morning fog. His wife Clara joined him at the doorway, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "What is it?" she whispered. He did not answer immediately. He knew the location. He knew what stood there. He had never written for the Daily Record. He had never held office. He had voted, yes, proudly, but he was not a leader. He built houses. He repaired staircases. He set beams true. He believed citizenship meant something solid. Smoke climbed higher. Children began crying somewhere down the block. Gunfire cracked faintly in the distance. Not many shots. Just enough. Elijah stepped inside and barred the door. He retrieved the shotgun from its place behind the kitchen cupboard and laid it across his lap as he sat in the front room. Clara gathered the children into the back bedroom. The house smelled faintly of pine and lye soap. He listened. Boots. Voices. Closer now. IV. The first shot. Near 4th Street, a small group of black men stood uncertainly at the edge of an intersection. Some held hunting rifles. One clutched an old revolver. They had not planned for battle. They had hoped, even after the newspaper burned, that destruction might stop there. The column of armed white men approached with measured pace. There are moments in history that pivot on seconds. A shout, indistinct. A sudden motion. Then a shot. No one later could agree who fired first. But once a bullet cracked the morning open, discipline gave way to noise. Rifles barked in staggered succession. Smoke drifted low. Windows shattered. Men ducked behind barrels and fences. One black defender, James Dudley, a longshoreman with calloused hands and 2 daughters, staggered backward as a bullet tore through his chest. He looked almost surprised. He tried to speak. Blood darkened his shirt. He fell against the dirt road. The exchange lasted minutes. It felt like hours. When it ended, the white militia still stood organized. The defenders scattered. James Dudley did not rise. The sweep. By mid-morning, the violence had widened. This was no longer confrontation. It was pursuit. Lists were produced. Names circulated. Teachers, business owners, politically active men. Doorsteps shook beneath rifle butts. Some were told simply to leave by sunrise. Others were struck. Families packed hastily, clothing, Bibles, small framed photographs, before slipping toward the swamps west of town. The swamp received them without question. Mud swallowed footsteps. Cypress knees jutted like broken fingers from black water. Mosquitoes swarmed even in November's chill. Fear carried its own heat. The river. At the docks, a longshoreman who would later testify quietly watched as bodies were lifted onto flatboats. He did not know how many. He did not ask. The Cape Fear River moved steadily beneath them, surface unbroken by what it carried. Official reports would later claim fewer than 10 deaths. The river did not count. City Hall. By noon, the column redirected toward City Hall. The building stood dignified, columns upright, as if unaware of the transition about to occur within. Inside, black aldermen and white Republican officials had been summoned. They walked through corridors lined with armed men. Rifles leaned casually against walls. No one shouted. The message did not require volume. Resignations were drafted swiftly. Hands trembled as signatures were written. Mayor Silas Wright stood aside. Alfred Waddell stepped forward. The oath was administered. Applause followed. Outside, smoke still drifted faintly across rooftops. By the time the sun reached its apex, Wilmington's elected government no longer existed. It had not been voted out. It had been removed. 8. After the noise. By late afternoon, the gunfire subsided. Fires smoldered. Streets were strangely quiet. The young man who had hesitated at the newspaper fire walked home alone. His rifle felt heavier now. His ears rang faintly. He passed James Dudley's abandoned cap lying in the road. He did not pick it up. In black neighborhoods, doors remained barred long after footsteps faded. Elijah Moore did not fire his shotgun. No one knocked on his door. That, too, would mark him. In the evening, church bells did not ring. Wilmington slept early, but it did not sleep peacefully. The headline. The next morning, newspapers across the South ran headlines. Race riot in Wilmington. The word riot traveled quickly. Riot implies chaos. Chaos implies mutuality. Mutuality implies shared blame. The men who had assembled at the armory understood language as well as rifles. They had restored order, and they had renamed it The shift. In the weeks that followed, police allegiance shifted, black leaders left, businesses closed. The coup's greatest victory was not November 10th. It was November 11th, and November 12th, and the quiet administrative weeks afterward. Violence establishes leverage, law secures it. Wilmington did not look destroyed. It looked corrected. That was the most astonishing part. Closing image. That night, the Cape Fear River reflected starlight. Boats moved as they always had. The current carried debris downstream. It carried silence. It carried the first day of a new political order. And in homes across the city, children asked questions their parents could not fully answer. The city that had governed together no longer did. The city that had believed in permanence had learned otherwise. Democracy had not collapsed in spectacle. It had been dismantled in daylight, and renamed before sunset. The man who left before the fire. The train left Wilmington in darkness. It did not leave quickly. Nothing in Wilmington ever did. The locomotive exhaled steam in heavy sighs, metal breathing against metal. Coal smoke curled upward into the night sky and dissolved among indifferent stars. A lantern swung from the side of the baggage car, casting a thin arc of yellow light across the platform. Alexander Manley stood half in shadow, hat pulled low. He had never liked trains. Too exposed, too linear, no deviation once movement began. A friend had come to see him off but kept distance. They did not shake hands. They did not speak long. Proximity was dangerous now. Go north, the friend had said earlier. They won't stop at the press. Manley had nodded once. He had written words before. He had not imagined they would be answered with rifles. The conductor called the final boarding. Manley stepped up into the car without looking back. He would look back once the train moved. The editorial. He replayed the words in his mind as the train lurched forward. Every Negro lynched is called a big burly black brute. He had written it deliberately. Carefully, not recklessly. He had cited hypocrisy, not fantasy. He had named what Southern society practiced but denied. He had known there would be anger. He had not anticipated orchestration. The train wheels began their steady rhythm. Iron against rail. Forward. He watched Wilmington's lamps shrink through the window glass. Then he saw it. Smoke. Not chimney smoke. Thicker. Rising from somewhere near 7th Street. His breath caught. The train did not slow. He did not yet know the press had been burned. He did not yet know men had died. But he understood that something irreversible had begun. He did not pray. He calculated. 2. The weight of leaving. Exile is not loud. It is quiet subtraction. The subtraction of familiar streets. Of known voices. Of routine. Manley sat upright in the narrow train seat, gloved hands folded tightly together. He carried one notebook, a change of clothes, a pistol, and memory. He did not carry his printing press. He did not carry his archives. He did not carry the bound volumes of the Daily Record that documented years of black political life in North Carolina. Those would burn. He imagined the office, the smell of ink, the metallic clatter of type, the worn wooden floorboards. He had walked those boards thousands of times. Now they would turn to ash. He wondered whether leaving had been cowardice. He knew staying would have meant death. Survival does not always feel like courage. Sometimes it feels like abandonment. 3. The first newspaper. The train reached Goldsboro by mid-morning. Passengers disembarked briefly to stretch legs and purchase coffee. Manley stayed seated. He kept his hat low. He did not yet know that Wilmington was being renamed. A man boarded with a stack of newspapers under his arm. Fresh ink, damp pages. Wilmington riot, the vendor called. Manley's head lifted involuntarily. Riot. The word struck him physically. He bought one copy without speaking. The headline read, Race riot erupts, white citizens restore order. He read every line. The burning of the Daily Record was described as a spontaneous reaction to inflammatory language. Black men were described as armed aggressors. White citizens were described as protectors. There was no mention of planning. No mention of lists. No mention of the armory. The narrative had solidified overnight. He felt something colder than fear. He felt erasure. It was not enough that the press had burned. The meaning of the event had been seized. Language had been confiscated. The train resumed motion. He folded the paper carefully. He did not tear it. He needed to remember how it was framed. IV. Survivor's arithmetic. By afternoon he began calculating. How many would die? How many would flee? Would Elijah Moore, though Manly did not know his name, remain? Would teachers be expelled? Would the aldermen survive the day? He tried to reconstruct the likely progression. Press destroyed, armed patrols, City Hall. He knew the men involved. He had written about them before. They were not impulsive, they were disciplined. Disciplined violence is more dangerous than rage. He closed his eyes briefly. Had he written too plainly? If he had softened the language, would the outcome differ? No. He knew the answer immediately. The editorial was spark. The fuel had been prepared long before. But guilt does not consult logic. It finds purchase regardless. V. The exile's geography. He changed trains in Richmond. The further north he traveled, the more the accents shifted. The air felt different, less humid, less weighted. In Philadelphia, he disembarked with no reception, no welcoming committee, no announcement. Exile is rarely ceremonial. He rented a small room under an assumed name. The landlord asked no questions. He unfolded the Wilmington newspaper again that night. More details had emerged. The Daily Record office had been burned completely. Multiple black citizens killed. The mayor replaced. The phrase race riot repeated in every paragraph. He laughed once, short, without humor. Riot, he said aloud to the empty room. Riot suggests accident. This had been engineering. V. The silence of distance. In the weeks that followed, Manly considered writing again. He had paper. He had ink. He had words. But he did not have platform. Northern newspapers were interested briefly, but not deeply. The Spanish-American War still commanded national attention. Expansion abroad was a more comfortable narrative than racial terror at home. When he described Wilmington as a coup, editors hesitated. Too strong, one said. Too inflammatory. He almost smiled at that. Inflammatory. The irony pressed heavy. He wrote letters instead, private correspondence to friends scattered across the country. He asked who had survived, who had fled, who had been arrested. Responses arrived slowly. Many did not arrive at all. Exile magnifies uncertainty. V. The internal trial. Manly placed himself on trial nightly. He reread his editorial from memory. He examined tone, sentence structure, word choice. Had he misjudged timing? Was truth a responsibility regardless of consequence? Or did responsibility include anticipating violence? He found no resolution. He did not regret the content. He regretted the cost. There is a difference. He began to understand that history would not remember his nuance. It would remember the fire. 8. The loss of voice. He attempted, months later, to establish another publication. Funding proved scarce. Investors were wary. Wilmington had demonstrated that black political journalism could be destroyed without federal consequence. Capital avoids vulnerability. He wrote smaller pieces, occasional essays. They lacked the reach of the Daily Record. He felt his influence narrowing. He had once addressed a city. Now he addressed a page. He did not stop writing. But something in him had shifted. The confidence that truth could alter trajectory had thinned. Ix. The news from home. A letter arrived in spring. Brief. Unsigned. Wilmington quiet now. Government changed. Many gone. Voting restrictions coming. He held the paper longer than necessary. Voting restrictions. He understood what that meant. Violence establishes leverage. Law secures it. The coup would not end in November. It would calcify. He realized then that exile was not temporary. He would not return. Not safely. X. The long view. Years later, when he heard that textbooks referred to Wilmington as a race riot, he did not express surprise. He had seen the first draft of that narrative on the train north. Language had been seized before bodies cooled. He understood something crucial. Violence without narrative control is unstable. Violence with narrative control becomes precedent. The burning of his press had not merely destroyed machinery. It had eliminated a counter-narrative. He had been one voice. The city had removed it. Closing image. On a cold Philadelphia evening, long after Wilmington's smoke had dissipated, Manly stood at a window overlooking unfamiliar streets. Snow fell lightly, something Wilmington rarely saw. He pressed his palm against the glass. In another city, children were growing up without knowing that multiracial government had once functioned in North Carolina. In Wilmington, streets bore the names of men who had orchestrated his exile. His newspaper no longer existed. But he did. Exile is survival without home. History would one day excavate the truth. He would not be there to see it. But he had written it once. And words, even burned, leave trace. The man who left before the fire did not escape history. He became part of its evidence. Chapter 12. The signatures. City Hall did not look afraid. Its white columns held steady beneath the late morning sun. The brick facade, warmed by light, gave no outward sign that governance inside was about to be dismantled. The gunfire had already echoed through parts of the city. Smoke still rose faintly from 7th Street, but in the center of Wilmington, order, visual order, remained intact. That was important. Coups that appear chaotic invite scrutiny. Coups that appear administrative invite acceptance. Inside the building, footsteps sounded hollow against the tiled floors. They were not the footsteps of elected officials. They were the footsteps of armed men. The summons. Shortly after 11 o'clock, messengers moved quickly through Wilmington carrying a single instruction. Report to City Hall. The recipients understood immediately what it meant. Black aldermen, white Republican officials, clerks aligned with the coalition government. They did not need to ask why. Outside the building, rifles were visible. Not raised, not aimed, visible. Visibility was sufficient. Elijah Moore stood half a block away, pretending to examine a wagon wheel that required no inspection. He watched as one of the black councilmen approached the steps, shoulders squared despite the rifles lining the entrance. The councilman did not look at the men. He walked past them. That dignity would matter later. 2. Inside the chamber. The council chamber was familiar to its occupants, oak desks arranged with civic modesty, tall windows filtering light across worn flooring, portraits hung in frames that had witnessed years of debate. Today, the room felt smaller. Armed men stood along the walls. Some leaned casually against pillars. Others rested hands on rifle stocks with deliberate ease. Alfred Waddell stood near the center of the room. He had removed his gloves. On the central table lay several sheets of paper. Pre-written, pre-prepared, the architecture of removal. Mayor Silas Wright entered last. He looked older than he had the week before. He did not ask questions. Waddell addressed the room. "We are here to prevent further disorder," he began, voice steady. "The present administration has proven incapable of maintaining the peace." Peace. The word drifted across the chamber like smoke. No one mentioned the armory. No one mentioned the burning press. No one mentioned the patrols moving through black neighborhoods. Language had already shifted. The violence was now described as reaction. The correction would be described as necessity. 3. The coercion without shouting. One of the black aldermen spoke first. "You have no authority to demand this," he said quietly. His voice did not shake. A rifle butt tapped lightly against the floor in response. Not aggressively, just enough. Authority was implied, not argued. Another councilman glanced toward the doorway. Armed men stood there as well. Exits were symbolic today. Waddell gestured toward the papers. "These resignations," he said, "will prevent further bloodshed." Prevent. As though bloodshed had not already begun. As though the armed presence in the room were not itself continuation. Silence filled the chamber. The choice presented was simple. Sign, or escalate. The escalation required no imagination. IV. The first signature. Mayor Wright stepped forward. He picked up the pen. His hand hovered for a moment. History sometimes pauses for a fraction of breath before moving irrevocably. He signed, ink absorbed into paper without resistance. A murmur passed through the armed men, not cheers, not celebration, just acknowledgement. One signature transformed confrontation into process. Process legitimizes force. One by one, others stepped forward. Some signed immediately. One hesitated. He looked directly at Waddell. "Is this how we govern now?" he asked. No one answered. He signed. V outside the chamber. Elijah Moore watched through an open window as shadows moved inside. He could not hear the words spoken. He did not need to. When the door finally opened and Alfred Waddell emerged, escorted but not guarded, the shift was visible. He walked differently. Ownership has posture. Behind him, former officials exited without escort. Without office. Without authority. There had been no vote. No ballot. No citizen consultation. Only signatures. Elijah felt something collapse internally, not violently, but quietly. He had voted in that building. He had believed that paper carried weight. Now he watched paper erase itself. V. The swearing in. The oath was administered swiftly. A clerk, voice steady but thin, recited the formal language. Waddell repeated it. "I do solemnly swear." The irony hovered but was not acknowledged. Applause followed from those permitted inside. Outside, life continued in fragments. A wagon rolled past. A shopkeeper reopened his door cautiously. Smoke thinned above rooftops. The coup was nearly complete. But the most consequential moment was still ahead. V. The appointments. Within hours, new names were placed into positions vacated by resignation. Police chief replaced. Council seats filled. Clerks reassigned. The machinery of governance resumed with new operators. No gap. Continuity is crucial in overthrow. Disruption invites intervention. Continuity suggests legitimacy. Telegrams were sent to state officials. Language was precise. Order restored. Disturbance resolved. Responsible leadership installed. By evening, the administrative record would reflect transition, not seizure. 8. The headline draft. In a nearby newspaper office, an editor reviewed language carefully. Riot had already been chosen. Riot distributes blame. Coup concentrates it. The headline was set in bold type. White citizens reclaim city. Reclaim suggests prior ownership. Ownership suggests right. Right suggests legitimacy. The typesetter arranged the letters without comment. Ink pressed to paper. The narrative hardened. Ix. The long afternoon. As afternoon stretched toward evening, armed patrols diminished in visibility. Rifles remained present but less prominent. The purpose had been achieved. Black neighborhoods remained tense. Families who had fled did not return. Doors remained barred. Elijah Moore placed the shotgun back behind the cupboard. He sat in silence. His wife asked, "Is it over?" He considered the question. The gunfire had stopped. The smoke was fading. City Hall stood intact. "No," he said quietly. "It's begun." X. The administrative calm. That night, Wilmington did not resemble a battlefield. There were no barricades, no smashed storefronts downtown, no public executions. Instead, there was paperwork. Orders issued, positions reassigned, statements released. The most astonishing feature of the day was not its violence. It was its efficiency. By sunset, the overthrow of an elected municipal government was complete. No constitutional amendment required, no federal troops intervened, no immediate prosecution followed. The coup did not present itself as revolution. It presented itself as correction. And correction is easier to defend. Closing image. After dusk, the Cape Fear River reflected faint stars. Boats shifted gently in their slips. In the quiet chamber of City Hall, the ink on resignation papers dried completely. Paper is fragile, but once signed, it can outlast gunfire. Wilmington had not fallen in spectacle. It had been transferred, from ballots to rifles, from representation to restoration, from democracy to discipline, and the transformation had taken less than a day. The swearing in. The oath was administered swiftly. A clerk, voice steady but thin, recited the formal language. Waddell repeated it. "I do solemnly swear." The irony hovered but was not acknowledged. Applause followed from those permitted inside. Outside, life continued in fragments. A wagon rolled past. A shopkeeper reopened his door cautiously. Smoke thinned above rooftops. The coup was nearly complete. But the most consequential moment was still ahead. The appointments. Within hours, new names were placed into positions vacated by resignation. Police chief replaced. Council seats filled. Clerks reassigned. The machinery of governance resumed with new operators. No gap. Continuity is crucial in overthrow. Disruption invites intervention. Continuity suggests legitimacy. Telegrams were sent to state officials. Language was precise. Order restored. Disturbance resolved. Responsible leadership installed. By evening, the administrative record would reflect transition, not seizure. 8. The headline draft. In a nearby newspaper office, an editor reviewed language carefully. Riot had already been chosen. Riot distributes blame. Coup concentrates it. The headline was set in bold type. White citizens reclaim city. Reclaim suggests prior ownership. Ownership suggests right. Right suggests legitimacy. The typesetter arranged the letters without comment. Ink pressed to paper. The narrative hardened. Ix. The long afternoon. As afternoon stretched toward evening, armed patrols diminished in visibility. Rifles remained present but less prominent. The purpose had been achieved. Black neighborhoods remained tense. Families who had fled did not return. Doors remained barred. Elijah Moore placed the shotgun back behind the cupboard. He sat in silence. His wife asked, "Is it over?" He considered the question. The gunfire had stopped. The smoke was fading. City Hall stood intact. "No," he said quietly. "It's begun." X. The administrative calm. That night, Wilmington did not resemble a battlefield. There were no barricades, no smashed storefronts downtown, no public executions. Instead, there was paperwork. Orders issued, positions reassigned, statements released. The most astonishing feature of the day was not its violence. It was its efficiency. By sunset, the overthrow of an elected municipal government was complete. No constitutional amendment required, no federal troops intervened, no immediate prosecution followed. The coup did not present itself as revolution. It presented itself as correction. And correction is easier to defend. Closing image. After dusk, the Cape Fear River reflected faint stars. Boats shifted gently in their slips. In the quiet chamber of City Hall, the ink on resignation papers dried completely. Paper is fragile, but once signed, it can outlast gunfire. Wilmington had not fallen in spectacle. It had been transferred, from ballots to rifles, from representation to restoration, from democracy to discipline, and the transformation had taken less than a day. Chapter 13. The names on the paper. The gunfire had stopped. That was the most deceptive part. By late afternoon on November 10, 1898, Wilmington sounded almost normal again. Wagons rolled cautiously through intersections. Store shutters reopened halfway. Smoke thinned into faint gray threads against the sky. But behind closed doors, something quieter and more enduring was underway. The lists had been prepared in advance. The table upstairs. In a second-floor office above a hardware store near Market Street, 4 men sat around a long oak table. The rifles that had been so visible hours earlier were absent. Hats rested neatly on chair backs. Jackets were folded carefully. Ink bottles stood open beside stacked sheets of paper. Violence had created leverage. Now came administration. One of the men unfolded a document and smoothed it flat with his palm. Names were written in tight, efficient script. Black aldermen, teachers, barbers known for political organizing, business owners with capital, preachers who had spoken publicly about voting rights. Not hundreds, not thousands, just enough. Targeted removal is more effective than mass panic. We give them until sunrise, one man said. Another nodded. Departure ensures stability. Stability. The word had replaced order now. Language evolves quickly when it protects power. 2. Campbell Street. Elijah Moore heard the knock just after dusk. Not frantic, not pounding. Measured. He froze. Clara stiffened beside him. The children had been told to remain in the back room no matter what. Another knock. He rose slowly and opened the door halfway. 2 white men stood on the porch. Neither raised a weapon. They did not need to. Elijah Moore? One asked. He nodded. You're not on the list, the man said flatly. But you'll keep quiet. The sentence landed heavier than threat. It implied surveillance. It implied continued evaluation. Elijah did not answer. The men moved on. He closed the door and leaned his forehead briefly against the wood. Not on the list. Relief and shame intertwined. Survival sometimes feels like complicity. 3. The teacher. On North 4th Street, Sarah Bellamy was packing books into a trunk. She had taught reading to black children for 6 years. She had organized voter registration workshops quietly on Sundays after church. Her name appeared near the middle of the list. The men who delivered the message stood in her doorway as she listened. You leave tonight, one said, or you will be escorted tomorrow. Escorted. She did not argue. Argument requires audience. There was none. She wrapped her school attendance ledger in cloth and placed it carefully at the bottom of the trunk. She paused over a stack of children's essays, small handwriting, careful effort. She left them on the desk. The men did not enter her home. They did not touch her belongings. They waited outside until she stepped past them carrying the trunk. The discipline was deliberate. There would be no broken windows. No visible looting. The city would appear orderly. IV. The barber. Thomas Green owned a barber shop near the docks. White men had sat in his chairs. He had trimmed their beards, heard their gossip, listened to political boasting disguised as casual talk. He had donated quietly to the coalition campaign. His name appeared third from the top. When the knock came, he knew before the door opened. How long? He asked. Sunrise, came the reply. My family? They go. He nodded once. His shop keys remained in his pocket. He would not return to retrieve them. Chapter 13. The names on the paper. The gunfire had stopped. That was the most deceptive part. By late afternoon on November 10, 1898, Wilmington sounded almost normal again. Wagons rolled cautiously through intersections. Store shutters reopened halfway. Smoke thinned into faint gray threads against the sky. But behind closed doors, something quieter and more enduring was underway. The lists had been prepared in advance. The table upstairs. In a second-floor office above a hardware store near Market Street, 4 men sat around a long oak table. The rifles that had been so visible hours earlier were absent. Hats rested neatly on chair backs. Jackets were folded carefully. Ink bottles stood open beside stacked sheets of paper. Violence had created leverage. Now came administration. One of the men unfolded a document and smoothed it flat with his palm. Names were written in tight, efficient script. Black aldermen, teachers, barbers known for political organizing, business owners with capital, preachers who had spoken publicly about voting rights. Not hundreds, not thousands, just enough. Targeted removal is more effective than mass panic. We give them until sunrise, one man said. Another nodded. Departure ensures stability. Stability. The word had replaced order now. Language evolves quickly when it protects power. 2. Campbell Street. Elijah Moore heard the knock just after dusk. Not frantic, not pounding. Measured. He froze. Clara stiffened beside him. The children had been told to remain in the back room no matter what. Another knock. He rose slowly and opened the door halfway. Two white men stood on the porch. Neither raised a weapon. They did not need to. Elijah Moore? One asked. He nodded. You're not on the list, the man said flatly. But you'll keep quiet. The sentence landed heavier than threat. It implied surveillance. It implied continued evaluation. Elijah did not answer. The men moved on. He closed the door and leaned his forehead briefly against the wood. Not on the list. Relief and shame intertwined. Survival sometimes feels like complicity. 3. The teacher. On North 4th Street, Sarah Bellamy was packing books into a trunk. She had taught reading to black children for 6 years. She had organized voter registration workshops quietly on Sundays after church. Her name appeared near the middle of the list. The men who delivered the message stood in her doorway as she listened. You leave tonight, one said, or you will be escorted tomorrow. Escorted. She did not argue. Argument requires audience. There was none. She wrapped her school attendance ledger in cloth and placed it carefully at the bottom of the trunk. She paused over a stack of children's essays, small handwriting, careful effort. She left them on the desk. The men did not enter her home. They did not touch her belongings. They waited outside until she stepped past them carrying the trunk. The discipline was deliberate. There would be no broken windows. No visible looting. The city would appear orderly. IV. The barber. Thomas Green owned a barber shop near the docks. White men had sat in his chairs. He had trimmed their beards, heard their gossip, listened to political boasting disguised as casual talk. He had donated quietly to the coalition campaign. His name appeared third from the top. When the knock came, he knew before the door opened. How long? He asked. Sunrise, came the reply. My family? They go. He nodded once. His shop keys remained in his pocket. He would not return to retrieve them. V. The train platform. By midnight, the Wilmington train platform was crowded, but not loudly so. Families stood close together beneath dim lantern light. Trunks, carpetbags, bundles tied in cloth. Children too young to understand clutched hands tightly. The conductor avoided eye contact. He had been told to expect increased departures. He did not ask why. Elijah Moore stood at the far edge of the platform, unseen among shadows. He watched Sarah Bellamy board. He watched Thomas Green step onto the train without looking back. He did not call out. To acknowledge publicly would mark him. Survival required quiet. As the train pulled away, the sound of iron wheels on track felt different than it had the night before when Manley departed. Then, it had carried one man. Now it carried community. V. The swamp. Not everyone chose the train. Some fled west toward the swamps. The cypress trees absorbed them without comment. Mud swallowed footprints quickly. Mosquitoes persisted even in November's chill. A preacher named Isaiah Roberts led 3 families into the lowlands before dawn. He carried no trunk, only a Bible wrapped in oilcloth. They would remain hidden for days. Waiting. Hunger sharpened fear, but they understood something critical. This was not temporary disturbance. This was redesign. V. The morning after. At sunrise on November 11th, Wilmington appeared stable. No barricades, no smoke, no public disorder. City Hall functioned. Police patrolled under new leadership. The newspaper headline had already framed the previous day. White supremacy triumphs. The word triumph carried celebration, not grief. In black neighborhoods, houses stood intact but altered by absence. Chairs empty at kitchen tables. Barbershop locked. Schoolhouse dark. Exile leaves negative space. 8. The counting. Later estimates would range wildly. Official tallies claimed fewer than 10 deaths. Eyewitnesses remembered dozens. Some historians would argue the number may have reached 300. But the number of dead, while staggering, was not the only metric. The number of expelled mattered. The number silenced mattered. The number who chose never to vote again mattered. Wilmington's black middle class did not vanish entirely. But it fractured. And fracture disrupts momentum. Momentum takes generations to rebuild. Ix. The quiet celebration. That evening, in parlors across white Wilmington, small gatherings took place. Brandy was poured. Men congratulated one another on discipline. We avoided chaos, one said. We saved the city, said another. The phrase would echo through decades. Saved. Language is scaffolding. It holds narratives upright long after foundations crack. X. Elijah's decision. 3 days after the coup, Elijah Moore walked past City Hall. No armed men stood outside now. The American flag fluttered normally above the entrance. He felt a pull toward the registrar's office. A stubborn instinct. A reminder that he had once believed participation secured permanence. He stood at the steps for a long moment. Then he turned away. He would never vote again. Not because he was forbidden, but because he had watched ballots dissolve beneath rifles. His withdrawal was not loud. It would not be recorded. But it was part of the coup's success. Democracy erodes not only when leaders are removed, it erodes when citizens retreat. 11. The permanent shift. Within weeks, new appointments stabilized governance. Police loyalty aligned with new authority. Black-owned businesses faced credit pressure. Property transfers increased quietly. No further gunfire was required. The city had been recalibrated. Violence had established leverage. Exile secured demographics. Administration sealed the transition. Closing image. On the outskirts of Wilmington, near the swamp line, a family who had fled stood watching smoke no longer visible. They debated returning. Maybe it is over, one whispered. But they had seen the lists. They understood something fundamental. When your name appears once, it can appear again. They moved north instead. The Cape Fear River continued its steady passage. It did not register who left. It did not mourn who stayed. But Wilmington had changed in a way that would outlast fire. The gunfire had lasted hours. The exile would last generations.
Chapter 14. The Amendment. 2 years after the smoke cleared, there were no more rifles in the streets. There were no patrols at dusk. No burning buildings. No bodies in alleys. There were ballots. And that was the point. The most effective coup is the one that eventually looks legal. The campaign of 1900. By early 1900, North Carolina's Democratic leadership understood that Wilmington had proven something critical. Force could succeed, but force alone was unstable. What was seized must be secured. Public speeches shifted tone. No longer openly triumphant about November 1898, party leaders spoke instead about reform, stability, and electoral integrity. They proposed a constitutional amendment. It would introduce a literacy test, a poll tax, a grandfather clause. On paper, the measures applied to everyone. In practice, they were surgical. 2. The architecture of exclusion. The literacy test required prospective voters to read and interpret a section of the state constitution, to the satisfaction of the registrar. Satisfaction. The word was elastic. Elastic language allows selective enforcement. A black man might read flawlessly and be told his interpretation was insufficient. A white man might stumble and be praised for effort. The poll tax required payment before voting. For many poor black citizens, especially those economically destabilized after 1898, this became an additional barrier. Then came the grandfather clause. If a man's grandfather had been eligible to vote before 1867, he was exempt from the literacy requirement. Before 1867, black men in North Carolina could not legally vote. The clause appeared neutral. It was not. It preserved poor white suffrage while excluding black voters. Violence had made reform possible. Reform would make violence unnecessary. 3. The rally. In Wilmington, a Democratic rally gathered beneath banners that read, "Protect the ballot. Safeguard civilization." Alfred Waddell spoke again, his voice measured, older now but no less deliberate. "We seek fairness," he said. "We seek a system that ensures responsible governance." Responsible. The word echoed from 1898. The crowd applauded politely, not with the fever of coup day, but with steady confidence. They were no longer seizing power. They were codifying it. IV. Campbell Street, 1900. Elijah Moore listened to the speeches from a distance. He no longer attended political meetings. He built houses. He repaired doorframes. He replaced stair rails worn smooth by use. But the amendment discussions reached even him. His neighbor, Samuel Carter, still believed in participation. "We have to vote against it," Samuel insisted one evening. "We have to show up." Elijah did not argue. He simply asked, "And if they're dissatisfied?" Samuel did not answer. The memory of rifles in City Hall did not fade easily. The vote. The amendment passed, not by overwhelming margin statewide, but by sufficient one. In heavily black counties, turnout had been suppressed through intimidation and confusion. In white-majority counties, turnout surged. By November 1900, North Carolina's constitution contained the new provisions. They were inked in clean script. No smoke accompanied the signing. No gunfire marked the moment. It was quieter than 1898. It was more permanent. The Registrar's Office, 1908. 8 years later, Thomas More stood inside a small registrar's office. He was 18. He could read. He had been educated by teachers like Sarah Bellamy before her exile. He had listened to his father's silence but not yet adopted it. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and paper. Behind a desk sat a white registrar with wire-rimmed glasses. Thomas handed over his poll tax receipt. The registrar nodded and slid a printed sheet across the desk. "Read this section and explain it," he said. The section described a clause in the state constitution concerning taxation authority. Thomas read slowly, carefully, pronouncing each word clearly. He explained its meaning in plain language. The registrar watched without expression. When Thomas finished, there was a long pause. "That's insufficient," the registrar said finally. Thomas blinked. "Sir, you did not fully explain the implications of legislative discretion." Thomas swallowed. He knew what legislative discretion meant. He had defined it. "May I try again?" The registrar shook his head. "You may reapply in the next cycle." Thomas stood still for a moment longer. He wanted to ask what exactly was lacking. He wanted to demand clarity. Instead, he nodded. He stepped outside into the afternoon sun. The courthouse flag fluttered overhead. He looked at it for several seconds. Then he walked home. He would never return. 7. The statistical collapse. Within 4 years of the amendment, black voter registration in North Carolina plummeted. In some counties, it dropped to nearly zero. White voter participation remained strong. The racial balance of political power that had once defined Wilmington disappeared entirely from state representation. It did not require another coup. The coup had already done its work. The amendment sealed it. 8. Economic consequence. With political power removed, policy shifted accordingly. School funding disparities widened. Black neighborhoods received fewer infrastructure improvements. Credit access tightened further. Without political representation, there was no leverage to contest inequities. Elijah Moore noticed the difference in contracts. Fewer commissions, delayed payments, banks less willing to extend credit. He did not articulate the connection explicitly, but he understood it. When ballots vanish, bargaining power follows. The quiet withdrawal. Thomas Moore boarded a train in 1916. He carried no protest sign, no public speech. He simply left. Baltimore offered shipyard work and anonymity. He did not tell his daughters about the literacy test. He did not describe rifles in City Hall. He said only, "Some places decide you don't belong." Silence travels more easily than trauma. Chapter 15. The Train North. In 1916, the trains leaving Wilmington were fuller than they had been before the coup. Not because of smoke, not because of gunfire, because of stagnation. There is a difference between danger and confinement. Danger is loud. Confinement is slow. Thomas Moore stood on the same platform where he had watched others depart in 1898. He was now 26 years old. His shoulders were broader. His posture was straighter. His silence more deliberate. He carried one suitcase. Inside were shirts, a shaving kit, a Bible, and the folded poll tax receipt from 1908. He had never thrown it away. The push and the pull. The Great Migration did not begin in one place or for one reason. It was not a single exodus. It was accumulation. In Wilmington, jobs along the port had narrowed. Contracts favored white labor. Black workers were offered irregular shifts, seasonal work, smaller pay. Up north, shipyards in Baltimore needed hands. World War I had intensified industrial demand. Northern newspapers printed advertisements. Steady work, good wages, room to advance. The promises were not entirely true, but they were not entirely false. Thomas did not expect equality. He expected oxygen. 2. The platform again. Elijah Moore stood with his son on the platform that morning. He had not wanted Thomas to leave. He had also not told him to stay. Clara held Thomas's small daughter, Ruth, who was barely 3. "You don't have to go," Elijah said finally. Thomas did not look at him. "I can't build a future where I can't vote," he replied. Elijah flinched almost imperceptibly. He had not voted since 1898. Thomas had tried. There was a difference. The train whistle blew. Steam rose. Elijah placed a calloused hand on his son's shoulder. North ain't heaven, he said quietly. I know, Thomas answered. But it ain't this. The train doors closed. Elijah did not wave. He had learned that departure is quieter when you do not mark it. 3. The journey. The train rattled north through pine forests and tobacco fields, through towns that resembled Wilmington in structure if not in name. At each stop, more black passengers boarded. Families with trunks. Young men traveling alone. Women carrying wrapped parcels. No one spoke loudly about why they were leaving, but they all understood. A man across from Thomas wore overalls and carried a folded newspaper. Baltimore? He asked. Thomas nodded. Shipyards, the man said. Thomas nodded again. There was comfort in shared destination, even if uncertainty waited at the end. IV, Baltimore Harbor. The first thing Thomas noticed was the scale. Baltimore's harbor stretched wide and busy. Smokestacks rose in rigid lines. Ship frames towered like skeletal cities within cities. The air smelled different. Coal and saltwater and iron. He found lodging in a narrow row house near the docks, sharing space with 3 other migrants from North Carolina. The work was hard. 12-hour shifts riveting steel plates into hulls. The sound of hammer on metal rang through bone. But wages were steady. Steady was revolutionary. The new boundaries. Baltimore was not free of segregation. Neighborhoods were marked unofficially. Some blocks were hostile after dark. White foremen supervised most departments. But there were differences. Black men could vote. Not easily, not universally welcomed, but legally. Thomas registered within months of arrival. The registrar did not ask him to interpret the Constitution. The registrar did not dismiss him. He left the office holding a small card that represented something he had once lost. He did not celebrate openly. He folded the card carefully and placed it beside the poll tax receipt from 1908. 2 documents. 2 systems. The silence at home. When Thomas wrote letters back to Wilmington, he described wages. He described the size of the ships. He did not describe relief. He did not describe the first time he cast a ballot in Baltimore. He did not tell his father that voting felt different when not negotiated. Some victories are too fragile to name. He returned to Wilmington only once, briefly, in 1922. The city looked stable. Segregated streetcars, separate schools, black neighborhoods contained but intact. City Hall stood unchanged architecturally. He did not step inside. He visited his parents. He walked past the lot where the Daily Record had once stood. No marker, no plaque, no acknowledgement, just absence. He returned to Baltimore the next morning. 7. The consolidation years, 1910 to 1940. As decades passed, Wilmington hardened into Jim Crow routine. Rail cars segregated, waiting rooms labeled, voting effectively restricted. The coup faded from public conversation. In white Wilmington, it was remembered as restoration. In black Wilmington, it was remembered in lowered voices. Children born after 1910 did not know multiracial government had ever existed. Segregation felt ancient. That is how democratic erasure completes itself. Not through forgetting, through replacement. 8. Elijah's final years. Elijah Moore never left Wilmington. He continued building houses. He refused political discussion. He did not discourage his grandchildren from asking questions. But he did not volunteer answers. When asked once why he never voted, he said, "Paper burns." It was the closest he came to explanation. He died in 1934. He had witnessed both possibility and reversal. He had chosen survival over confrontation. History does not record men like Elijah in textbooks, but their withdrawal reshapes participation. The wealth gap emerges. By mid-century, disparities in Wilmington were measurable. Black home ownership lagged. Business ownership stagnated. Public investment diverged. Property once owned by black entrepreneurs before 1898 had shifted gradually into white control. Wealth compounds. So does exclusion. The economic cost of the coup did not appear immediately in ledgers. It appeared decades later in census tables. History accrues interest. The next generation. Thomas Moore's son, Elijah Jr., grew up in Baltimore hearing fragments of Wilmington. Not stories. Fragments. Your granddaddy built houses. There was trouble once. Things changed. Elijah Jr. enlisted in the Army in 1943. He would fight in a segregated unit. He would land in Europe under an American flag that promised liberty abroad while limiting it at home. He did not yet know that his grandfather's silence began in a chamber filled with rifles. But he carried its consequence. Closing image. In 1916, as Thomas's train first crossed the Mason-Dixon line, he had leaned toward the window to see the landscape shift. He had not felt triumphant. He had felt cautious. Migration is not escape. It is recalculation. Wilmington remained behind him, but the forces that had reshaped it were not confined to one city. They were structural, and structures travel. Chapter 16. The Double Victory. In 1943, Elijah Moore Jr. stood in a line of men beneath a canvas awning in Baltimore and waited to be assigned a uniform that did not quite fit. He was 21 years old. He had never lived in Wilmington. He had never seen the smoke of 1898. But he carried it, not in story, in structure. The draft. The war had already been underway for nearly 2 years when Elijah Jr.'s draft notice arrived. The letter bore the federal seal. He unfolded it carefully at the kitchen table. His father, Thomas Moore, watched in silence. "You going?" Thomas asked. Elijah Jr. nodded. There was no visible conflict in the answer. Baltimore had offered work. America now demanded service. Thomas did not speak of Wilmington that evening. He did not say, "Your grandfather stopped voting because men with rifles took City Hall." He did not say, "We left because law closed behind us." He said only, "Keep your head steady." 2. Segregated service. Training camp in Georgia was segregated. Separate barracks, separate dining halls, separate assignments. The Army assigned Elijah Jr. to a supply and engineering unit, labor-intensive work essential to the war effort but rarely celebrated. He loaded equipment. He repaired bridges. He transported materials. White soldiers in combat units passed him occasionally, offering nods that were not quite acknowledgments. The irony was heavy but unspoken. The United States was fighting fascism abroad. In uniform, Elijah Jr. was entrusted with machinery. Out of uniform, in many parts of the country, he could not drink from the same fountain as the men beside him. 3. Europe. In 1944, Elijah Jr.'s unit crossed the Atlantic. The ocean was gray and endless. He stood on the deck and watched gulls follow the ship until land disappeared. In France, he saw towns reduced to rubble by war. He saw civilians displaced. He saw a continent fractured by authoritarian ambition. He did not compare it aloud to Wilmington, but he felt the parallel. Governments fall. Power reorganizes. Narratives justify. He heard white officers speak of democracy as sacred. He did not disagree. He simply wondered why sacred things could be so unevenly distributed. Letters home. From Europe, he wrote letters to Baltimore. He described landscapes. He described cold mornings. He described comradeship. He did not describe contradiction. Thomas read the letters slowly at the kitchen table. He sometimes paused at phrases like liberation and freedom restored. He did not comment. He understood the weight of language. Wilmington had taught him that. Versus return. When Elijah Jr. returned home in 1946, Baltimore greeted him with modest ceremony. Uniform pressed, medals pinned, neighbors congratulating him. He removed the uniform that evening and hung it carefully in a closet. The next day, he boarded a segregated streetcar. The war had ended. The system had not. The GI Bill. The GI Bill offered opportunity. Education funding, housing loans, vocational training. On paper, it applied universally. In practice, local banks and institutions filtered access. In Baltimore, Elijah Jr. managed to secure enrollment in a trade program. Some black veterans in the South were denied outright. Structures bend differently depending on geography. Elijah Jr. learned electrical work. He purchased a modest home in a predominantly black neighborhood using a loan that required more documentation than his white counterparts faced. Still, it was progress. Incremental. Hard won. 7. Wilmington, 1948. In Wilmington, segregation had solidified. Streetcars labeled, schools separated, voting nearly extinguished for black citizens. The coup of 1898 was rarely mentioned publicly. If referenced at all, it was described as a regrettable disturbance, as though weather had shifted temporarily, as though rifles and lists had not redrawn civic reality. Black political power had not returned. Economic disparities were visible but normalized. The absence of multiracial governance had become habit. Habit becomes culture. 8. The quiet memory. Elijah Jr. visited Wilmington once in 1950. Thomas had insisted. "See where we started," he said. They walked along the Cape Fear River. The docks remained active. Buildings had changed but not entirely. Elijah Jr. asked, "Where was it?" Thomas hesitated. "The paper." Thomas nodded. They stood before an unmarked lot. Nothing indicated what had burned there. No plaque, no stone. History sometimes leaves no physical scar, only structural consequence. Elijah Jr. did not press further. He understood that silence carried protection as well as pain. X. The shift in language. By the 1950s, the phrase race riot had solidified in textbooks. Children learned the term without interrogation. In white classrooms, it implied black aggression. In black classrooms, teachers sometimes added quiet correction. It was more than that, a teacher might say softly, but correction remained cautious. Memory had not disappeared. It had been edited. Editing is a form of control. X. The next movement. By 1963, Elijah Jr.'s children were teenagers. They watched television footage of Birmingham, of sit-ins, of marches. The civil rights movement did not begin in Wilmington, but its echoes reached there. The Voting Rights Act would arrive in 1965, nearly 70 years after rifles entered City Hall. Elijah Jr. registered to vote that year in Baltimore with his daughter beside him. He signed his name deliberately. Thomas, now elderly, watched. He had left Wilmington to reclaim suffrage. His father had surrendered it in fear. 3 generations, 3 different relationships to the ballot. History does not move in straight lines. It oscillates. Closing image. In Wilmington, the Cape Fear River still moved steadily. Children played near docks. Tourists photographed antebellum homes. Few paused to ask what had occurred in November 1898. But structures shaped by that week remained embedded in zoning maps, wealth distributions, school funding lines. War had expanded American power abroad. Civil rights would expand participation at home. But the distance between 1898 and 1965 was not merely years. It was structural repair, and repair is slower than destruction. Chapter 17. 1965. When President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965, Wilmington did not erupt in celebration. There were no parades, no fireworks over the Cape Fear River, but something invisible shifted. For the first time since rifles had lined the walls of City Hall in 1898, the federal government had re-entered the architecture of Southern voting. Not as distant observer, as enforcer. The language returns. The Voting Rights Act did not invent rights. It restored enforcement. It targeted literacy tests. It authorized federal examiners. It required certain jurisdictions to receive federal approval before altering voting laws. North Carolina fell under scrutiny. Wilmington, too. The literacy test that had humiliated Thomas More in 1908 was now illegal. On paper, paper matters, when protected. 2. The registrar's desk, again. In a modest county office in Wilmington, a black man named Harold Jenkins stepped forward to register in late 1965. He was 32 years old. He had served in Korea. He had paid taxes his entire adult life. A federal examiner sat behind the registrar's desk that day. The literacy test forms had been removed. The registrar, older now, glanced at the examiner before speaking. Name? He asked. Harold answered. He signed. No interpretation requested. No subjective evaluation required. The transaction lasted less than 3 minutes. Harold stepped outside holding his voter registration card. He stared at it longer than necessary. 3 minutes had undone 67 years of structural exclusion. But undoing damage is not the same as reversing it. 3. The quiet surge. Within 2 years, black voter registration in North Carolina surged. Not explosively, steadily. Churches organized registration drives. Community leaders distributed information. Older residents who had once withdrawn cautiously returned. Some who had fled Wilmington decades earlier wrote letters home asking whether things were different now. Some returned briefly to test it themselves. But generational absence leaves gaps. Political participation is habit. Habits broken for decades take time to rebuild. IV. Elijah Jr.'s reflection. In Baltimore, Elijah Moore Jr. watched news footage of Southern registration lines. He had voted for years, but seeing federal marshals escort black citizens into courthouses stirred something inherited. He thought of his grandfather, a man who had once believed in paper until paper failed him. He thought of his father, turned away with a constitution in hand. He folded the newspaper slowly. About time, he said quietly. But timing matters. The Restoration had come nearly 70 years after removal. 7 decades of policy had already reshaped wealth, schools, neighborhoods. The ballot had returned. Power would return more slowly. Versus Wilmington's political return. By the 1970s, Wilmington elected black officials again. Not in the numbers of the 1890s, but visibly. City council seats, school board positions. For the first time in generations, black political presence in municipal government did not feel anomalous. It felt possible, yet the memory of 1898 lingered. Not in headlines. In caution, older black residents advised younger candidates. Keep your head steady. The phrase had traveled through time. Vi. The textbook. In 1974, a North Carolina high school history textbook included a brief paragraph about Wilmington 1898. It described a race riot resulting from political tensions. No mention of planning. No mention of forced resignations. No mention of exile lists. Students memorized the date. They did not learn the structure. Language shapes inheritance. 7. The economic divide. By 1980, census data revealed measurable disparities in Wilmington. Median household wealth differed sharply by race. Home ownership rates lagged. Business ownership gaps persisted. These were not new developments. They were cumulative. Political rights had been restored. Economic compounding had not been reversed. The coup's most durable damage was not limited to ballots. It was balance sheets. 8. The archivist. In 1995, a historian at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, LaRae Umfleet, began gathering scattered references to the events of 1898. Private letters, newspaper clippings, minutes from secret meetings. She noticed something unsettling. The public record described chaos. The private record described coordination. The gap between the two was wide. Archival research is excavation. It uncovers not what is absent, but what was buried. X. The Commission. In 2000, the state of North Carolina established the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot Commission. The name still contained riot, but the mandate was broader. For 6 years, researchers compiled evidence. Witness accounts preserved in family law. Official documents. Political correspondence. By 2006, the final report concluded. The violence was premeditated. The government was overthrown. Black citizens were targeted deliberately. The term coup d'état was accurate. More than a century after the event. Recognition does not reverse outcome, but it recalibrates memory. X. The marker. In 2008, a historical marker was erected in Wilmington. Bronze. Permanent. Public. It did not use the word riot alone. It acknowledged overthrow. Tourists passed it casually. Students paused to read. Some residents objected. It tarnishes the city, one argued at a council meeting. Another responded. It tells the truth. Truth rarely feels comfortable when it disrupts inherited narrative. 11. The structural lesson. By the early 21st century, scholars began citing Wilmington in broader discussions of democratic erosion. It had not required foreign invasion. It had not required constitutional suspension. It had not required military dictatorship. It required manufactured crisis, media alignment, organized militia, administrative efficiency, legal codification. The pattern was visible, and patterns matter. 12. The river. On a cool evening in 2010, a group of high school students stood along the Riverwalk and read the marker aloud. The Cape Fear River moved steadily behind them. One student asked, "Why didn't anyone stop it?" The teacher hesitated. Because stopping requires recognition, and recognition requires naming. The rifles in City Hall had been visible. The amendment of 1900 had been procedural. The textbook language had softened. It took a century to reclassify the event accurately. The river continued its flow. Water does not correct memory. People must. Closing image. In 1965, federal law returned protection to the ballot. In 2006, the state returned accurate language to the record. Restoration came in increments. Destruction had come in increments too. Wilmington's story was no longer buried, but it was not yet fully understood. Because understanding requires not just acknowledgement of the past, but recognition of pattern. Chapter 18. The Box in the Attic. In the summer of 2018, the heat in Wilmington pressed downward like a hand. Air moved slowly through the narrow streets of older neighborhoods. Ceiling fans hummed without much conviction. Cicadas sang in waves from trees that had witnessed more than anyone alive remembered. Caroline Waddell had not come home to find history. She had come to clean. Her grandmother had died in late spring. The house on Market Street, large, white, carefully maintained, now felt cavernous and oddly quiet. The funeral had been well attended. Neighbors had spoken warmly of legacy, of family name, of civic contribution. Waddell. In Wilmington, the name carried weight. Caroline climbed into the attic because that was where unwanted things were stored. Boxes, holiday decorations, photo albums, old ledgers. The air was thick and stale. She brushed aside a coil of Christmas lights and found a cedar box wrapped in oilcloth. It was heavier than it looked. The ledger. Inside the box were letters tied in ribbon, and beneath them, a ledger. The cover was cracked leather. The pages thick and yellowed. The handwriting unmistakably 19th century. Caroline recognized the signature immediately. Thomas Waddell, her great-great-grandfather, the man whose portrait hung downstairs in the hallway, formal, dignified, framed in gold. She had grown up hearing that he helped restore the city. Restore. The word had always sounded civic. Responsible. She sat cross-legged in the attic dust and opened the ledger. The entries were not reflective. They were procedural. Payment distributed to patrol volunteers. Transportation arranged for departure of 11 colored families. Coordination confirmed with JD. Meeting secured with committee. Caroline read the lines twice. They did not sound like riot. They sounded like logistics. 2. The shift. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. The moment when inherited identity fractures against new evidence. Caroline had studied history in college. She knew about Wilmington 1898. She had never connected her family directly to its mechanics. The ledger did not contain rhetoric. No slurs. No emotional justifications. Just implementation. She felt something colder than anger. Vertigo. Her grandmother had never mentioned this. Family stories emphasized leadership, civic duty, preservation. The ledger suggested orchestration. There is a difference between participating in chaos and designing order. Her ancestor had designed. 3. The choice. She closed the book. For several minutes, she simply sat there in the heat. The attic felt smaller. There are moments when history presents itself as decision. She could return the ledger to the box, rewrap it, preserve the family narrative, or she could show it. Exposure carries cost. Silence preserves comfort. She did not decide immediately. She took the box downstairs. IV. The historian. Within weeks, Caroline contacted a historian at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Dr. Michael Torres had studied the coup for years. When Caroline placed the ledger on his desk, he did not speak for nearly a minute. He turned pages carefully. He stopped at the entry referencing departure of 11 colored families. He looked up. "This," he said quietly, "is operational documentation." Operational. The word landed heavily. Most historical accounts relied on narrative reconstruction, speeches, newspapers, second-hand letters. This was infrastructure, evidence of planning not just in ideology but in execution. Caroline felt both exposed and oddly relieved. The ambiguity had ended. The public reaction. When the ledger was authenticated and made public months later, Wilmington reacted unevenly. Local headlines read, "Descendant reveals coup documents." Some praised transparency. Others accused Caroline of dishonoring her lineage. "You're betraying your heritage," one commenter wrote online. Heritage. The word implies inheritance without interrogation. Caroline did not apologize for being born into her family. She did not accept personal guilt. At a town hall forum held in a modest auditorium downtown, she said, "I cannot change what my ancestor did, but I can refuse to hide it." The room was divided. Some black residents expressed anger, not at her, but at the long silence. Some white residents shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded. Truth rearranges comfort unevenly. The emotional landscape. After the town hall, an older black woman approached Caroline quietly. "My grandmother told me about the lists," she said, but nobody ever believed her. The sentence carried more than validation. It carried recognition. Archives do not only preserve documents, they confirm memory. Caroline understood then that the ledger did not merely implicate her ancestor. It validated generational testimony. Silence had protected reputation. Disclosure protected truth. 7. The broader pattern. Historians examining the ledger noted its structural clarity. There was no frenzy in its pages. No evidence of improvisation. It documented committee coordination, press alignment, volunteer payment, transportation logistics. The coup had not been mob violence. It had been administration with rifles. Scholars began citing Wilmington more prominently in discussions of democratic erosion. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was archived. 8. The psychological inheritance. Caroline found herself re-examining childhood memories. Family dinners where civic pride was discussed. School presentations where the Waddell name was framed positively. Tour guides referencing restoration. She did not resent her grandmother. She understood the human instinct to protect lineage. But protection through omission sustains distortion. She visited the historical marker downtown one afternoon alone. Tourists walked past casually. She read the text slowly. Coup d'état. The word was now official. But it had not always been. Language evolves, sometimes painfully. The modern city. In 2018, Wilmington was vibrant. Riverwalk crowded, restaurants full, new housing developments rising. The economic disparities, however, remained measurable. Neighborhood lines still reflected older patterns. Property ownership still concentrated unevenly. The coup's effects were not visible in smoke. They were visible in data. History compounds. The river again. One evening after the town hall, Caroline stood along the Cape Fear River. The water moved steadily, reflecting amber streetlights. She tried to imagine November 10, 1898. Men marching, press burning, bodies carried. The river did not reveal its memory, but the city did. In zoning maps, in wealth distribution, in archived minutes. Her family name would remain attached to Wilmington. That would not change, but what it represented could. Silence sustains structure. Exposure shifts it. Closing image. The cedar box no longer sat in the attic. It rested now in a climate-controlled archive. Catalogued, accessible, permanent. The ledger did not undo the coup. It did not restore lost wealth. It did not resurrect the dead. But it disrupted myth. And disruption is the first stage of repair. Wilmington's winter of 1898 had once been minimized. Now it was documented. Memory had moved from whisper to record. The question that remained was no longer whether it happened. It was whether its pattern would be recognized elsewhere. 8. The psychological component. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson is this. The men who orchestrated the coup did not believe they were destroying democracy. They believed they were saving it. Authoritarian restructuring often frames itself as preservation. This psychological reframing is critical. If participants believe they are defending civilization, they tolerate escalation. Fear justifies action. Narrative sanctifies it. Law stabilizes it. X. The economic reinforcement. Political power and economic power reinforce one another. After 1898, credit tightened for black businesses. Property transfers shifted. Public investment favored white neighborhoods. Economic weakening reduces capacity for political resistance. Economic dependency increases compliance. The coup did not merely remove officials. It redirected capital. Capital compounds. So does exclusion. X. The myth of permanence. One of the most dangerous democratic myths is permanence. That democratic systems, once established, remain secure. Wilmington disproved that. The United States Constitution remained intact in 1898. No amendment was suspended. No foreign army invaded. Local organization, narrative control, and legal codification were sufficient. Democracy eroded without dramatic constitutional rupture. It eroded procedurally. 11. Modern echoes. In the 21st century, scholars analyzing democratic backsliding globally identify similar warning signs. Delegitimizing election outcomes, weaponizing media ecosystems, encouraging paramilitary protection, normalizing emergency rhetoric, rewriting legal frameworks after power shifts. The contexts differ. The technology differs. The structure remains recognizable. Wilmington is not prophecy. It is precedent. Precedent lowers psychological resistance. 12. The quiet victory. The coup's greatest triumph was normalization. Within one generation, it was described as necessary. Within two, misunderstood. Within three, barely mentioned. Normalization is more durable than violence. Violence shocks. Normalization settles. Once settled, it feels natural. 13. The responsibility of recognition. The final lesson of Wilmington is not despair. It is vigilance. Democracy is not self-enforcing. It depends on institutional integrity, independent media, economic inclusion, accurate historical education, public willingness to confront fear narratives. Remove enough of these simultaneously, and erosion accelerates. Restore them, and repair becomes possible. Incrementally. Closing image. The Cape Fear River still moves past Wilmington. It does not pause at 1898. It does not bend around memory. But cities can bend. Societies can adjust trajectory. The blueprint revealed in Wilmington is not destiny. It is warning. The rifles were visible. The lists were written. The amendment was passed. The pattern was clear. The question now is not whether it happened. It is whether patterns are recognized before they harden again. Chapter 20. The cost that compounds. There are two kinds of damage in history. The damage you see immediately, and the damage that compounds quietly. Wilmington's smoke cleared within days. Its structural shift did not. Before the break. In 1897, Wilmington's black middle class was not hypothetical. It was documented. Black-owned grocery stores lined certain blocks. Barbershops doubled as civic hubs. Teachers educated a rising generation literate enough to vote and organize. Black aldermen held office. Black policemen patrolled streets. Property ownership among black residents was growing. Economic participation and political participation reinforced one another. Momentum existed. Momentum matters. When upward mobility compounds, it changes trajectory. The coup interrupted compounding, and interruption has mathematics. 2. Wealth interrupted. Wealth does not grow in dramatic leaps. It grows through continuity. A business passes to a son. A property appreciates. A loan is repaid. A second loan becomes possible. When businesses close under duress, when property is sold below value, when credit tightens, continuity breaks. After 1898, black-owned businesses declined sharply. Property transfers shifted toward white consolidation. Insurance claims for damages were frequently denied. There is no single ledger line that reads, "Wealth erased." Instead, there are decades of smaller entries. Loan denied. Contract withheld. Property undervalued. Compounding reversed. 3. The census tells the story. By mid-century, census data revealed measurable disparities. Home ownership gaps widened. Median income diverged. Educational funding lagged in black neighborhoods. These were not spontaneous developments of the 1940s or 1950s. They were the long tail of 1898 and 1900. Political exclusion reduced bargaining power. Reduced bargaining power influenced policy. Policy influenced capital flow. Capital flow influences generational wealth. History compounds like interest. So does exclusion. Chapter 20. The cost that compounds. There are two kinds of damage in history. The damage you see immediately, and the damage that compounds quietly. Wilmington's smoke cleared within days. Its structural shift did not. Before the break. In 1897, Wilmington's black middle class was not hypothetical. It was documented. Black-owned grocery stores lined certain blocks. Barbershops doubled as civic hubs. Teachers educated a rising generation literate enough to vote and organize. Black aldermen held office. Black policemen patrolled streets. Property ownership among black residents was growing. Economic participation and political participation reinforced one another. Momentum existed. Momentum matters. When upward mobility compounds, it changes trajectory. The coup interrupted compounding, and interruption has mathematics. 2. Wealth interrupted. Wealth does not grow in dramatic leaps. It grows through continuity. A business passes to a son. A property appreciates. A loan is repaid. A second loan becomes possible. When businesses close under duress, when property is sold below value, when credit tightens, continuity breaks. After 1898, black-owned businesses declined sharply. Property transfers shifted toward white consolidation. Insurance claims for damages were frequently denied. There is no single ledger line that reads, "Wealth erased." Instead, there are decades of smaller entries. Loan denied. Contract withheld. Property undervalued. Compounding reversed. 3. The census tells the story. By mid-century, census data revealed measurable disparities. Home ownership gaps widened. Median income diverged. Educational funding lagged in black neighborhoods. These were not spontaneous developments of the 1940s or 1950s. They were the long tail of 1898 and 1900. Political exclusion reduced bargaining power. Reduced bargaining power influenced policy. Policy influenced capital flow. Capital flow influences generational wealth. History compounds like interest. So does exclusion. The myth of individual failure. By the late 20th century, some narratives framed economic disparity as individual failure. Lack of effort. Poor choices. Cultural weakness. These explanations ignore structure. Wilmington demonstrates how structure alters trajectory. When access to capital tightens deliberately, when political power is removed intentionally, when public memory reframes violence as chaos, outcomes shift predictably. The coup was not a spontaneous riot. It was organized removal of leverage. Leverage lost is opportunity lost. 7. The national mirror. Wilmington is not unique in this dynamic. Across the United States, similar episodes disrupted black wealth accumulation. Tulsa, 1921. Rosewood, 1923. Dozens of lesser-known towns. Property destroyed. Businesses burned. Communities displaced. Wealth interrupted once compounds downward for generations. Wilmington's coup did not burn an entire district. It burned political infrastructure. Political infrastructure underwrites economic stability. Destroy that, and you destabilize growth. 8. The restoration gap. By the time the Voting Rights Act restored federal protection in 1965, nearly 70 years had passed. 70 years of divergent accumulation. Even with restored suffrage, even with elected black officials returning, economic convergence does not occur overnight. It requires capital access, educational investment, Housing equity. Time. Time lost cannot be refunded. X. The modern data. In the early 21st century, analysts examining Wilmington's wealth distribution found persistent gaps. Median household wealth differed significantly by race. Home ownership rates remained uneven. Business ownership disparities endured. These are not anomalies. They are lineage. The coup's effect did not end when rifles left City Hall. It embedded itself into property deeds, loan practices, school funding formulas. The violence was visible for a day. The compounding lasted a century. X. The inheritance of structure. Caroline Waddell understood this as she reviewed economic studies alongside her ancestors' ledger. The ledger documented logistics. The data documented consequence. One showed design. The other showed outcome. She did not inherit guilt. She inherited structure. Everyone in Wilmington did. The question was no longer whether the coup occurred. It was whether its compounding effects would be acknowledged. Acknowledgement does not assign personal blame. It clarifies origin. Without clarity of origin, solutions misdiagnose cause. 11. Repair. Repair is not reversal. You cannot resurrect burned presses. You cannot return land sold under duress. You cannot restore missed decades of compound growth. But you can invest deliberately, educate accurately, distribute resources equitably, protect participation aggressively. Repair is incremental. So was erosion. Closing image. On a modern afternoon, children play soccer in a park near downtown Wilmington. Parents sit in folding chairs. Cars pass slowly. The river glints beyond trees. The scene appears ordinary. It is. Ordinary stability is not automatic. It is maintained. In 1898, ordinary stability was interrupted deliberately. The cost of that interruption compounded for generations. The cost remains visible, not in smoke, in spreadsheets, in zoning maps, in median wealth figures. History is not abstract. It is structural, and structure, once built, lasts.